also putting this out on Facebook. We're doing Facebook Live or whatever they call it. The first time I ever used Facebook Live, so I'm kind of excited about it. When I told the people on that go to my blog that I was going to be speaking, everybody said, well, we'd love to hear you. It's too bad you're going to be in Troy, Michigan. You know, I have people from all over the world that attend the blog, so they wanted to hear me. So I said I'd put it out on Facebook, and there was a lot of interest in that. So my beautiful wife is up front here putting this out on Facebook for me. She was a little bit concerned when I told her I was going to be speaking. My wife knows that I did a fair amount of public speaking when I was younger, but you know, we're talking like 20 years ago. I don't think I've given a public address in probably at least 20 years, probably almost exactly 20 years actually. And she was a little bit, you know, she said, well, aren't you a little bit nervous about it? And I said, well, I haven't forgotten everything about public speaking. I actually, when I was in college, I learned a really, really good German trick for public speaking. And she said, what's that? And I said, beer.
Yeah.
So I really shouldn't be joking, though, because actually the presentation is somewhat serious. What I want to do is I want to talk about what I consider to be, and what I think other people consider to be, an existential threat, not only to the Libertarian Party, but to libertarian values in general. And of course, this country was founded in libertarian values, at least at the federal level. You know, the states were allowed to do what they wanted to, and at least at the federal level, this was a very libertarian country, kind of founded at the height of the Enlightenment. Libertarianism being, you know, the product of the Enlightenment, kind of the heart and soul of it, if you will. So I'm going to talk about what that existential threat is, and I'm going to call it modern liberalism. The agenda, we're going to talk about what libertarianism is. We're going to talk a little bit about postmodernism. We're going to touch on political theory, or critical theory. We're going to talk about political correctness. We're going to compare cultural Marxism to liberty and talk about how those two concepts are diametrically opposed to one another. We're going to talk about the ideological battle between those two concepts, and then finally we'll have a conclusion and then go into questions. First thing I want to do, because I'm going to use the word liberal a lot, and I really don't like using the word liberal because, of course, liberal, liberty, libertarian, they all have the same root. Classical liberalism is what? It's essentially libertarianism. So I really don't like using the word liberalism when I talk about concepts from the left. At the same time, you know, the phrase that's used the second most for it is progressivism. And who wants to say that these concepts are progressive? I mean, progressive is, you know, it's progress. Well, I don't want to progress in that direction. I don't think some of these values are very, very positive. So, you know, you can't call it progressive. So I decided I'd go ahead and do what everybody else does and just go ahead and call it liberalism. But I wanted to define that. But one of the things that I find that always happens when I try to define what other people say is that they tell me that I'm creating a straw man argument. So rather than doing that myself, I wanted to show a brief video and allow liberals to do that for me. So I've gone ahead and queued this up. And I'm just going to play a very brief video.
Line up! Line up! Everybody line up! We're about to race! Everybody line up!
Is that loud enough? Yeah.
Shoulder to shoulder! Take off your backpacks! Basketball, line up! We're about to race! Hey, we are racing for a $100 bill. The winner of this race will take this. It's a $100 bill. Before I say go, I'm going to make a couple statements. If those statements apply to you, I want you to take 2 steps forward. If those statements don't apply to you, I want you to stay right where you're at. Take 2 steps forward if both of your parents are still married. Take 2 steps forward if you grew up with a father figure in the home. Take 2 steps forward if you had access to a private education. Take 2 steps forward if you had access to a free tutor growing up. Take 2 steps forward if you never had to worry about your cell phone being shut off. Take 2 steps forward if you never had to help mom or dad with the bills. Take 2 steps forward if it wasn't because of your athletic ability. You don't have to pay for college. Take 2 steps forward if you never wondered where your next meal was going to come from? I want you guys up here in the front just to turn around and look. Every statement I've made has nothing to do with anything any of you have done. Has nothing to do with decisions you've made. Everything I've said has nothing to do with what you've done. We all know these people up here have a better opportunity to win this $100. Does that mean these people back here can't race? No. We would be foolish to not realize we've been given more opportunity. We don't want to recognize that we've been given a head start. But the reality is we have. Now, there's no excuse. They still got to run their race. You still got to run your race. But whoever wins this $100, I think it'd be, and everybody who's back on that line, I guarantee you some of these black dudes would smoke all of you. And it's only because you have this big of a head start that you're possibly going to win this race called life. That is a picture of life, ladies and gentlemen. Nothing you've done has put you in the lead that you're in right now. When I say go, on your mark, get set, go! If you didn't learn anything from this activity, you're a fool.
Should I add these people or leave it alone?
So that, he said, is life.
Don't touch it, okay.
Now, who thinks that was life? Is that a fair representation of life? Well, there's certainly some fair things that are stated in there. I mean, every good lie is a kernel of truth, right? When Hitler said the Jews burned down the Reichstag, that started with the Nazis burning down the Reichstag. You know, it's not like he walked out in the middle of Berlin and said, look, the Reichstag's still standing. No, it burned down. The Germans made clear, they were very careful to make sure it burned down. And people believed that the Jews burned down the Reichstag. The Nazis were able to solidify their power and take totalitarian control on the belief of that. But the story of how it happened and who did it was a complete, utter fabricated lie. So, there's a kernel of truth in this. Everybody in here probably has some level of privilege in their lives, right? Or what at least the left would call privilege. I think most of us went to college. Most of us probably had two-parent households. Now, we had various things in our lives that, yeah, we did start out with a leg forward, a leg up on everybody else. I've got 2.5, almost 3 degrees. Obviously, I've got a step forward to somebody that never graduated high school. So, yeah, you do have some of that in life. Isn't that right? But everything else in that video is somewhat false. If I wanted to make a video where I wanted to show what life is really like, using race as an analogy, a race rather as an analogy, I wouldn't say, well, it's $100 and only one person's going to get it. Because life's not like that at all, is it? Bill Gates, I think, is worth, what, $60 billion again? $83 billion, thank you. Rich guy. If I'm lucky, worth about $8.30. I don't have the same advantage Bill Gates has. I've got 2 children. They're wonderful children. I think they're very bright. One of them's already in college. He's doing well. Hopefully the other one, when he goes to college, as well. But, they're going to Western. Bill Gates' kids are going to Stanford, Harvard. My kids have to take out student loans. His kids don't have to do that. But am I incapable of earning an income because Bill Gates is richer than I am? Are my children incapable of earning an income because Bill Gates is richer than I am and because his children have advantages that I don't have? Chelsea Clinton, her first job out of college, $500,000 a year working as an analyst for NBC. Absolutely no job requirements at all. They call her up and say, Chelsea, can you do an interview? Yeah, I can do an interview. $500,000 a year for that. My kids don't have that advantage. But nor are my kids necessarily harmed by her having that advantage. So the concept that is a $100 bill, and everybody is racing for that $100 bill. Only one person gets it, everybody else loses. That's not life. Life doesn't work that way. If we wanted to make a fair representation of life as a race, the first thing that we would do is we would take every participant and we would segment them in lanes. everybody runs their own lane. You're not allowed to cross over to somebody else's lane. Then instead of saying you get $100, we would take money, and every lane would have the same amount of money. And the lanes would essentially have to go on a long, long, long way, because, you know, you continue to run until you die, right? That's what life is. So we'd put money along those lanes, and then at the beginning of the first race, we might say, okay, if you have a two-parent household, take 2 big steps forward. If you have this, take 2 steps forward, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, they're going to pick up the money as they go forward. And some people are going to start with a little bit of money in their pocket, and some people are going to start with absolutely nothing. And then we say, okay, now race. Everybody's going to go forward as quickly as they can. They're going to collect as much money as they want. And of course, life isn't just about money. I'm just trying to run with their analogy. But everybody's going to collect as much money as they can as they go through their lane. And at some point, you're going to say, you know, race over. It's not going to be the same amount of time for everybody, because everybody doesn't have the same lifespan everybody else does. But wherever you finish, you know, now we're going to go through. We'll take maybe half the money everybody collected, because you spent some of it over the course of your lifetime. Somebody representing your children takes over for you. And then they race starting at that point with whatever you were able to give them, and they continue along. And the point of this is that the success of one person does not cause the failure of another. We're not really racing each other in life at all. At least I don't think we are. I think we're racing ourselves, if that makes sense. So, yes, some people do have advantages others don't have. That's natural. I know myself, I want to put my children, I want to give them as many advantages as I can. I think we all probably want the best for our children. That's what being a parent is. But the concept that doing that for your children is at the expense of somebody else or their children, I want everybody to do that. I think the worst thing you can tell somebody is that you have absolutely no opportunity in life. It is, you know, you'll never achieve anything because these people have advantages you don't have, and because of that, there is nothing you can do. Now, I know one thing: if I do nothing in my life, if I sit back and say, well, woe is me, it's all working against me, you know, there's privilege out there and I can't do anything, I know where my kids are starting. They're starting at the same point I did. I will have done nothing as an adult, as a parent, to make sure that my children maybe have an advantage too. So when we talk about liberalism, we're not talking about all Democrats. I think what I'm talking about is maybe the base of the Democrat Party. You know, that force that is continuously pulling them to the left. There's also a force in the Republican Party. It's pulling it right. It's not just the Republican Party. It's conservatism in general. Rand Paul says that libertarians are the most conservative people in the country because we are the ones that are the true flame bearers of the American ideal. Thank you. Thank you. So, you know, we're the force pulling the country toward traditional American values. This is the force trying to pull it away. So when I talk about liberalism, when I talk about liberals, I'm not talking about all Democrats. As we go a little further, we'll see that they're actually libertarians in the Democrat Party. I'm talking about a specific set of ideologies that were well, you can see it in her face too, but it was in that video. Next thing I think we have to do is we have to talk about what libertarianism truly is. I don't mean the Libertarian Party, because the Libertarian Party polled, what, 1% of the last couple of presidential elections? 3.5. 3.5. That's a record for the Libertarian Party. I was hoping the Libertarian Party was going to beat Ross Perot's number, which I think was about 11%. 19%. I voted for Ross Perot. That was my first presidential election. If you look up what a libertarian is, in the American Heritage Dictionary, it simply says somebody who believes in libertarian ideals or libertarianism. If you look up libertarianism in the American Heritage Dictionary, it says an extreme laissez-faire political philosophy advocating only minimal state intervention in the lives of citizens. And I looked at that, and I don't always like the definitions that are put in. I don't like the way the definitions change, often for political reasons. But I looked at that and I said, other than the word extreme, which I don't think laissez-faire capitalism is extreme myself. So I don't like the word extreme in that, but other than that, a laissez-faire political philosophy advocating only minimal state intervention in the lives of citizens. Is that not what libertarianism is? I think we probably all agree with that. And there's a fairly wide band that would pretty much agree with that. I think on the extreme end of libertarianism, you have a lot of anarcho-capitalists who don't believe there should be any government at all that consider themselves libertarians. I would say if you think there's no government, maybe a little further than libertarian, but you know, a lot of them do consider themselves libertarian. And certainly, and some ideas of a quasi-government agency that just isn't called government. I mean, there's certainly libertarianism borders on anarcho-capitalism on the one extreme of libertarianism. And maybe they even have some things in common more than a border. On the other extent, on the other extreme of what you might call libertarianism, you have the constitutional conservatives, who believe that the country is basically founded the way it should be, at least at the federal level. You don't leave the states alone to do what they want. You can be a constitutional conservative and want socialism at the state level. You know, if we truly followed federalism, California could be as liberal as it wants to be. It wouldn't affect the rest of us, it would only affect California. But they could say, yeah, I'm a constitutional conservative because I don't want that done at the federal level. And they'd be safe there. But I think most constitutional conservatives want a limited, somewhat minimal government. So certainly there's a border there with traditional libertarianism, and probably a lot of overlap in beliefs, at least as you're talking about that part of the constitutional conservative movement. The big thing is, libertarians do what? We put liberty ahead of equality, right? That, to me, is the core of libertarianism. We talk about the non-aggression principle. We talk about if you want to smoke dope, you should be allowed to do so. We talk about a lot of different things. But the bottom line is, liberty comes first. As Milton Friedman said, countries that put liberty ahead of equality tend to have a high level of both liberty and equality. Now, the old saying, 3 generations from shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves. You may make enough money, your kids don't have to work, but they're going to squander some of your income. Your grandkids are going to squander the rest of it. And then your great-grandkids, well, they've got shirt sleeves again. So, now that for a long time was the American norm. But when you put equality ahead of liberty, you end up without very much of either one. That was Milton Friedman. Getting into the libertarian, those that call themselves libertarians, there are 2 basic schools of thought. You've got Ayn Rand and you've got Milton Friedman. Ayn Rand kind of looked at libertarianism as almost a moral prerogative. If it's not libertarian, it's almost evil. So non-libertarian values she looked at very, very negatively. I don't know, has anybody here read Ayn Rand? Atlas Shrugged? There's a lot of good stuff in Ayn Rand. And I think she's right that libertarianism is moral, that a country that does not subscribe to libertarian values is at least encroaching upon potentially becoming immoral. But Milton Friedman had a very, very different perspective on libertarianism. His perspective was, it works. So he was what he might have referred to as a practical libertarian. He didn't believe in libertarianism just because he thought, well, it's immoral not to have a libertarian. Any country that is beyond that is immoral. He looked at it and said, you know, libertarianism works. Yes, it's moral also. And of course, the objectivists, the Ayn Rand followers, would say, well, yes, it works also. But the way they approached libertarianism was very, very different. And because of that, you have 2 kind of different schools of libertarian thought. I think the objectivists are probably more apt to be members of the Libertarian Party, whereas the practicalists are more apt to be, some of them in the Libertarian Party, but they're libertarian-minded, but not necessarily in the party, if that makes sense. They tend to be practical. They say, well, you know, I believe social issues are more important, so I'm going to vote with the Democrats because they're more apt to win. Or, well, I believe, you know, fiscal and economic issues are more important. The Republicans tend to agree with me on those, so yeah, I don't agree with them on these issues, but I'm going to vote there. And, you know, those are a fairly large number of people. You pull 3% of the national vote in the presidential election, but according to the Cato group, 22% of the population would ask on values, what are you? They'll say, well, yeah, I guess I agree mostly with libertarians. And there are some surveys that go as high as 70%. Those are surveys where they ask a very wide range of questions over a very wide range of issues, and they say, you know, what do you believe on this? And in some surveys, as many as 70% of the U.S. population will tend to pick libertarian answers to those questions. So this tells us that when we talk about what a libertarian is, you know, we're talking about somewhere between 22% of the population, which is a very, very significant number. You start running against Republicans and Democrats with 22% of the population in your court. And 70%, which is, you know, a supermajority. 70% of the population, if they voted as libertarians for libertarian candidates, you would have, you know, you'd be able to run a 2/3 majority through the House and Senate with that if you could get all of those people to vote as a bloc. Start getting to postmodernism versus rationality. Now, does anybody here know what postmodernism is? It's a philosophy that it was the beginnings of it. You can actually go all the way back to René Descartes, back to the French Revolution era. But the name postmodernism and the modern version of postmodernism, it goes about into the mid-20th century. It started in American English departments, and what happened was English professors said, you know, almost every word in the English language has at least 2 definitions. Some of them have 4 or 5 definitions. So you pull open the dictionary, you can see it. There are multiple definitions for most words in the English dictionary. And they said, well, you start taking words and putting them together in sentences, and taking sentences and making paragraphs, and making pages and chapters and books. You get to a book like Moby Dick, or you get to a document as long as the U.S. Constitution, and you have an almost infinite number of possible ways that you can interpret it. And that's true. If you were a computer and you had to decide what the best way to interpret the U.S. Constitution is, it would be an infinite number, but there would be a very, very, very exponentially large number of possible interpretations based on all of the possible definitions of every single word. But then postmodernism, no, that's actually true. What postmodernism does is they take a step, they kind of jump a bridge too far, and they say there is no rational way to determine which of those possible interpretations is correct. Therefore, they're all equal. Well, I got bad news for anybody who believes that, but no matter how many times you read Moby Dick, it's about a guy hunting a whale that bit off his leg. There's a lot of social commentary in Moby Dick. I don't know if anybody's actually read Moby Dick. I lumbered through it years and years ago. About half the book is plot line. About half the book is almost like a manual on how to hunt whales. So half of the book is fun, half of the book make it a little bit boring. There's a chapter on how to make a harpoon. But however you slice that, it's got a plot line, it's got characters. You can't possibly say there are an infinite number of ways to interpret that book. You can say there are nuances that we can debate on in terms of the social commentary, in terms of, is this guy a tragic hero or whatever. But I think anybody who reads Moby Dick is reading the same story. So I think really what we have is a somewhat narrow band of legitimate interpretations and a very large number of interpretations that maybe a computer would have a hard time saying this one's right, this one's wrong. But as human beings, I think we can intuitively pick a better sort of interpretation over one that's not as good. So that's where it started. But from there it moved into humanities and sociology departments. What they said in humanities and sociology departments is, now that's true in the English departments, but the rational physical world around us, we're really not very good at interpreting it. We have limited senses. We can look at the world, we can hear the world, we can touch the world, we can taste the world, we can smell the world, but really our ability to interact with the physical universe around us is limited by the fact that we're looking at it with the senses that we're given. Not only that, but they said, those senses, they're imperfect. There's a high level of interpretation in what we see and what we sense. I may see one thing, somebody else may see something else. You have witnesses to a crime, and they can't even tell you what the person looked like who committed the crime. All kinds of things. They said, there are a nearly infinite number of ways to interpret the physical world around us. And then they went again, a bridge to, that's actually true. I do a lot of work with computers, with programming, and I know how hard it is to program a robot that can interact with the physical world. It's very, very difficult to do, because a robot, without the ability to think, without the ability without the cognizance of self, has to try to look at a physical landscape and figure out what everything is, and figure out, how do I use these things? What are they for? Well, that's hard to do for a computer. Very easy to do for human beings. So again, there's a nearly infinite number of ways, in theory, to interpret the physical world around us, but how many ways are there that are actually useful? How many ways are there that actually make sense? Well, again, it's a very, very narrow subset of all of the possible ways to interpret our senses. If I take a ball and I drop it, I know it's going to fall. If I pick the same ball up and drop it again, I know it's going to fall. Well, what postmodernists say is, the Enlightenment's dead, rationality is silly, you don't really know anything, everything is subjective, everything you see is subjective, everything you hear, feel, facts are subjective, truth is subjective. And that's why you'll hear postmodernists talking about, this isn't about you, it's about me, I know you have your truths, but you need to listen to my truth. That's why you hear them saying these things, because they're making the physical world, they're making rational truth and reality subjective. And they truly believe that it is. Well, that's it's spread throughout it's spread throughout our colleges. It's encroaching upon our high schools. When you talk to teachers and you talk to when you talk to college professors. Now, it's more in the humanities, sociology departments, and English departments. You don't see a lot of it in engineering departments. You don't see a lot of it in business schools. Certainly, you're not going to see a lot of science professors or science instructors that are teaching this stuff. But it's all throughout the humanities and sociology, and it's an attempt to end rationality and to end the Enlightenment. It's kind of a counter-Enlightenment, going back to, well, I can believe whatever I want. That's what Descartes was doing. Descartes was saying, I think, therefore I am. I don't know anything else in the universe. And he did that as a mechanism in a world that was becoming increasingly rational to continue to believe in God. Well, I don't know you have a lot of Christianity in postmodernism, but they're doing the same kind of break where they're saying, I can't believe in rationality because it's not telling me what I want to hear, so let's make it subjective and believe we want. And as a pure philosophy, there's a lot to go with it. And as a pure philosophy, I know I don't agree with it, but I mean, you would think that if you believe everything is subjective and that you can believe whatever you want and all truths are equal, well, you think that's a very libertarian belief system. Because there is no objective truth. Everybody can believe whatever they want. You would think that would tend to lean toward people believing lots of different things and celebrating not only diversity of people or diversity of nationality or diversity of skin color, but diversity of ideas. And yet we see the exact opposite of that. They seem to center around a very, very specific set of ideas. And a lot of that is because, again, it comes out of English departments and in humanities and sociology, which tend to be very liberal parts of college universities. So what I think happened, not what I think happened, what did happen is it merged with another belief system that it was largely compatible with, but they had very specific ideas that kind of became a part of that. One of those is critical theory. Now everybody here knows what, has anybody heard the term critical theory? It's based on, a couple of people have, it's based on identity politics. And identity politics is the belief that as individuals, our individualism doesn't really matter much. We're driven by, a lot of this in that video that we just watched, we're driven by the different identity groups. Maybe one of my identity groups is I have two parents. Maybe one of my identity groups is that I'm white. Maybe one of my identity groups is that I'm a male. You've got all of these different identity groups. And what they do is they say you've essentially got a hierarchy of identity groups where you've got white Christians, cisgendered, straight men at the top, and they oppress everybody. At the bottom, I don't know what the most oppressive group in the country is. Maybe gay, lesbian, transsexual Muslims. I don't know, some group that has absolutely no advantages whatsoever and is considered the most oppressed group in the country. And then you have almost a caste system or a hierarchy of different identity groups between those. You might think of it like a diamond, where you have some oppressive groups, some highly oppressed groups, and what critical theory says is if you can get everybody within a society to believe that this is true, that they are a member of an identity group, that your individualism doesn't matter, that you're identified by the group you're in, that people will turn against each other and the society will collapse. Now, it's necessary to have society collapse if you are, we're going to get into next culture, which is cultural Marxism. We're going to eventually move into that. It's necessary to believe this because this all sprouted out, I'll get into more detail on this later, it all sprouted out after World War I. And there's a specific reason we'll get to in just a minute about why they want people to believe this. But the point is, for a long time, nobody really paid any attention to it, and it began to gain traction within the United States. And I put up a little graphic here. This is kind of a critical theory graphic, and it says, for a fair selection, everybody has to take the same exam, please climb that tree. Well, obviously, the fish is not going to be able to climb the tree. But, when you really drill this down, and let's say they're all monkeys, or that they're all rabbits, or that they're all fish, and you say, take a math test. Or they're all people, I should say. And you say, here, take a math test. We're going to test your math proficiency. Well, saying climb the tree, that does test the proficiency of climbing trees. It's just not all of those creatures climb trees. But I think all people, hopefully, are capable of doing some level of mathematics, or some level of reading, or some level, tests make sense. So the idea that we cannot test competence in different disciplines is silly. Hence, as the graphic is silly. Political correctness is, this is really gets to the heart and soul of what liberals believe. Now, the reason political correctness is correct is because if you analyze critical theory, if you critically analyze critical theory, you'll notice that, for example, supposedly cisgendered straight white men run the country. It's a very westernized patriarchal system, as they say. Well, if that were true, then you would think that straight white men would make the most money, right? As a group, we should be the richest people out there, straight white men. The truth is that Asian Americans make more money on average, as do Indian Americans, not Indian Americans and Native Americans, but from India, make more money than do white people. Yes, men make more money than women on average, but if you break that down to a further classification and look, for example, only at people who have never been married and never had children, in other words, people that are fending for themselves and not other people, all of a sudden, women make more money than men. It's about 8%. The reason for that, of course, is not that women are more apt to go to college than are men. So there's a reason for that too. That's not because men are oppressed. I'm not saying that at all. When you look at, within different races, you look at, for example, white Americans and African Americans. And people say, well, white Americans make more than African Americans. Well, that's true. But if you look only at people that of different ethnicities that have two-parent incomes or two-parent households, they grew up with two parents, all of a sudden that discrepancy goes away. And in fact, if you look only at people who have two college-educated parents, African Americans from those families make more money on average as adults than white people do. That's probably because it's so much harder for them to get there. I mean, you don't have as many of them. So, but the point is that when you do critical analysis of critical theory, no, we are not all identity groups. We are all individuals. If we are identity groups, we're identity groups of one. And when you critically analyze critical theory, when you look at the numbers and you drill down and say, well, I don't just want to look at the top numbers of men versus women. I want to look at what drives those differences. And I want to see, is it truly oppression by identity groups, or is there something else behind it? Critical theory falls apart. And the people who created critical theory knew that. So what they came up with is political correctness. What political correctness says is, if you are not a member of an oppressed group, you are not allowed to discuss the oppression. And furthermore, if you're a member of an oppressed group, say Thomas Sowell, and you discuss the oppression, but you say it doesn't exist, at least not in the way you're making it sound like it exists, well, now you're a traitor to your group, and you're even worse than somebody who's not oppressed. Now, you want to look at the most hated African Americans in the country, most of them are conservatives. You want to look at the most hated women in the country, most of them are conservatives. They're people that speak out against the supposed interests of their identity groups. So that's what political correctness is. You can't say I'm wrong if you can't question it. No critical analysis, it doesn't have to make sense. One thing that we do a lot on the conservative groups, whether it's libertarians, Republicans, whatever it is, we say that we want equal opportunity. We don't want equal treatment under the law. Or we want equal opportunity but not equal outcomes. Has anybody heard that? Equal opportunity, not equal outcomes? It's a fairly common refrain. The problem with that statement is, in order to have equal opportunity, you have to have two things. You have to have equal treatment under the law, obviously. But unless you believe that your children have the same advantages that Chelsea Clinton had, you can't really say that you have equal starting points, which is also necessary to have equal opportunity. The fact of the matter is we are not an individual-based society. We always say we are. We're not an individual-based society. Parents will go to great lengths. They'll sacrifice great amounts of money, great amounts of time, great resources to provide for a better opportunity for their children. And that really is not very rational, because we have every reason to believe our children are going to do better than we will. It's been true for every generation of Americans. The kids always do better than the parents. Not in every case, but overall. So we have every reason to believe our children are going to live better lives than we did, and yet we sacrifice a great deal to help our children. The reason for that is we're not an individual-based society, we're a family-based society. We believe in family. We love our children, we love our spouses, we love our parents, we love our family. Because of that, we sacrifice a great amount to make our children have better outcomes, hopefully, than we could have. It's impossible to truly have equal opportunities as long as we have a family base. If we want to be like the Spartans and say at 4 years of age we're going to take all the kids and raise them for the state, well, maybe now you can talk about having equal opportunity, but I don't know if we really want to do that. To me, what we really want to do is we want to have equal treatment under the law. That's really all we can provide. That creates the race where, yeah, maybe I start farther ahead than you, or you start further ahead than me, but I can still progress. I can still put my children in a better position than I was, and they can put their children in a better position than they were, and they can put their children in a better position than they were. And as long as everybody believes success is possible, as long as everybody believes I can propel myself forward, that opportunity exists, well, some may do better than others over time, but you know, over a longer period of time, generation after generation after generation, this tends to lead to a higher level of equality. Not less, more. Again, back to the old saying, 3 generations from shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves. Cultural Marxism. Originally, cultural Marxism was just critical theory and political correctness. Those were actually, I'll go back to the history on it. During World War I, Marxist followers they weren't necessarily ecstatic about the war, but they were ecstatic about the situation the war created. Imagine having the carnage of Flanders Fields. You know, you've got millions of people crossing the battlefield and getting mowed down. You know, just the carnage of that, the raw carnage of World War I. It was an absolute horrific nightmare. In addition to that, all of the enlisted people were everyday people. They were your proletariat. And all of the officers were, you know, the nobility. You had a conflict where you had a clear distinction between bourgeoisie and proletariat. And you had all of the carnage in the world. The bourgeoisie said, you know, run out there, I'll be somewhere behind you. You take the bullets, I'll take the glory. And they looked at that and they said, there is no way the workers of the world are going to allow this to happen. This war will either end by the kind of revolution that we're looking for, or when the war is over, people will go back to their countries, back to Germany, back to the United States, back to France, to England, and they're going to say, we can't do this again. We need radical change. We're going to go do what Karl Marx said. Well, then the war ended, and yeah, in Russia they had a red revolution. Russia became a communist country. Ironically, according to Marx's theory, only an advanced capitalist nation would become communist. Russia was one of the few participants in the war that was still agrarian. They should not have. They were the one country that the Marxists would have said, well, they're not ready for this yet. All of the countries that by Marxist theory were ready, they all rejected. Everybody went back home, they went back to work, they went back to their families, back to their jobs. And they said, why is that? Why didn't this work? And they came up with 2 reasons why it didn't work. The first reason was that you know, even by 1920 in the United States, the majority of American households had a car. France, England, these were relatively rich countries. Germany, well, Germany was devastated by the war, but prior to that, it was a relatively advanced, rich country. And they looked at it and they said, you know, we're essentially telling these people from each based on their ability, to each according to their needs. But right now, they're making far more. They have far better lifestyles than they actually need. So what are we going to tell the workers of the world, rise up and earn less? Now that doesn't make a lot of sense. As a consequence, it wasn't gaining a lot of traction. People went back and said, no, I kind of like the fact that I have a car, that food waits for me at the grocery store rather than me waiting for food in a line. I kind of like this system better than the one you're describing to me, so it didn't work. That was one problem, was they said, well, the proletariat in the West are too rich. And they actually looked at it as a problem. The poor were too rich. The other problem, and that was, of course, because they're looking at communism almost like a religion, where they believe it not because it works, but because they were trained to believe it, they were taught to believe it. Marx is God, and we're going to go with that. The other problem they had was they looked at Western society, Western values, the values of the Enlightenment, and they said this is all based on the individual. This is all based on individual rights, individual freedom, individual opportunity, individual achievement. It's all based on the individual, if not the individual, the individual and their family. So how the hell do you teach people to want collectivism when everything they've ever learned is the opposite of it? And they're richer than they would be under a collectivist system to boot. Well, the answer is, back to critical theory, how do we tear it down? How do we turn different members of society against other members of society? How do we make them put proletariat versus bourgeoisie isn't going to work, but by God, we can come up with something. And we will pit man against man, people against people, and we will destroy Western culture, Western civilization, Western society, Western values. The whole thing needs to burn to the ground. And then from the ashes, we'll come up and do something else. And that will be collectivism. So that was what cultural Marxism was. They actually, and sometimes I talk about what cultural Marxism is, and people will say, well, you know, that's what do they call it when they don't want people to believe it? Like when you say 9/11 was an inside job, what do they call that? Conspiracy theory, thank you. Yeah, you talk about this stuff and people say, well, that's conspiracy theory. Well, it's a conspiracy, certainly, but these people have been writing books since the end of World War I. You can go to the library and read them telling you, yes, this is what we are going to do. They've been writing about it for over 100 years. Saul Alinsky's Rules for Radicals, Cultural Marxism. They've been writing about this for over 100 years. So they can't really say with any credibility that that's not the plan, that they haven't been working on this, that it's not a real conspiracy. It's not a theory, it's real. But of course, going back to postmodernism, you can write books about it and then say, well, that's not really what the book means. You know, you just throw the letters up in the air, they fall down wherever they are, interpret what you want, every book ever written, there it is on the floor. You know, when you look at the world through those lenses, you don't have to be factually correct to have other people look at the world through your lens and believe you. So, that's cultural Marxism. The problem with cultural Marxism from a libertarian perspective is that it is completely, utterly incompatible with liberty. What they claim is that if people are left free, they will associate with identity groups, not as individuals, but as members of groups. And those groups will then vie for power. They actually teach that the only reason different identity groups communicate with each other is to propel power, either to gain power or to maintain it. So there's no reason to communicate between groups other than to do that, which is why the whole concept of speaking from oppression up, from being oppressed up, not from oppression down, is such a big part of the dynamic within liberalism. What they're essentially doing is saying that liberty is the cause of oppression, that if people are left free, they will oppress each other. Liberty being the cause of oppression, the solution is, well, we can't have no oppression because if the state doesn't oppress us, we'll oppress each other. But if we have oppression by the state, at least we won't have oppression by identity groups. We can essentially take a cultural and intellectual and moral elite out of the identity group structure. And we could use them as kind of a vice. You take the top and the bottom, you elevate the bottom, you compress the top, and you compress society until everybody's on the same level. And now you're all equal. That's kind of the theory with it. Well, that's obviously grossly incompatible with liberty, which is why I say this is an existential threat, not only to the Libertarian Party, but to everything we believe in as libertarians, to everything that we hold dear in terms of libertarian values, to the Enlightenment as a whole, and everything that came out of it. Now, you can't have a world in which oppression by the state is the only way to live. And yet that is what they do. They say oppression by the state will give us equality and harmony under cultural Marxism. You have to talk about political nationalism and political globalism because that all plays into this as well. Now, when you use the word nationalism and globalism, people tend to conflate that with economic nationalism and economic globalism. I don't think, being in a libertarian room, I'll bet there is not a single economic nationalist in here. I think we all like free trade. We may quibble on how to do that. Like I would say, you know, you don't need an agreement for free trade. You need an agreement for exceptions to free trade. If you want free trade, all you have to do is say trade freely with us, and we'll do the same with you. We reciprocate in kind. If you don't trade freely with us, we will reserve the right not to trade freely with you. But you don't need an agreement for free trade. You need an agreement for exceptions. What was the Trans-Pacific Partnership? Probably, if you were to put it in the floor, you're probably taller than I am. It wasn't a book of free trade. It was a book of exceptions to free trade. It was a book of rules. It had nothing to do with free trade. So we might quibble on exactly how to get free trade, but I think everybody here would say that we want to have global free trade as much as possible. That the whole world would be better off if people traded, if countries traded freely, if borders did not matter to goods and services. But that's not what political nationalism or political globalism is. Political globalism says that, you know, borders between countries are just silly lines, and it shouldn't matter what side of the line somebody lives on. That you shouldn't have to stay here. You shouldn't have borders. You shouldn't have boundaries. Everybody should just be able to go where they want, and we'll all live in peace and harmony. The problem with that is, you know, we're standing right now in Troy, Michigan. Now, whose laws apply in Troy, Michigan? Troy's laws, America's laws, Michigan's laws. If I go to Indiana, I'm subject to different laws. If I go to Canada, I'm subject to different laws. Well, if you don't have defined nation states, then how do you know whose laws apply? Well, you could say natural law, but how do you enforce natural law? How do you, when I talk to anarcho-capitalists, they always say, well, if you believe in a state, you're a statist. And there's a lot of people believe if you believe in a state, you're a statist. My answer to that is give me a single example throughout human history of a libertarian country that did not exist within the bounds of a nation state. The fact of the matter is that if you want to have a non-aggression principle, somebody's got to enforce it. And it's difficult to enforce it as individuals. We spend all of our lives in our house, in a bunker with a gun waiting for somebody to steal our stuff. No, it makes far more sense, it's far more efficient to have some kind of a body that can do that for us, which is why libertarians are generally small state, not no state, with some exceptions. I had some very, very interesting conversations with people who say, well, you can protect property as a group, as a collective, in a purely voluntary way. And yeah, you could probably come up with some ways to do that. I'm not here to say that you have to. I'm not here to say that the government, the way we look at a government, is the only way to do the role of government. I'm just saying that if you don't have rules that are enforced in some mechanism, then you don't end up with a libertarian paradise. You end up with the original government was the caveman with the biggest club and the most willingness to swing it at his tribe mates. He became the warlord, that everybody else, either you get hit or you follow him. And that tends to be what comes out of anarchist situations. It's kind of a transitionary period between one form of government and another one. So yeah, your natural laws, absolutely. No, the Declaration of Independence comes right out and says it. These laws don't come from government. They come from something larger than that. They're natural laws. They just plain exist. You can't take them away. They're a natural state of man. So I agree with you on that. The question is, how do you enforce that without the existence of some kind of a nation state? And if you have nation states, then either you have one nation state, which is the entire world, or you have different nations where different people within those nations are free to decide themselves, self-determination, how that country is going to be run. So when I talk about political nationalism versus political globalism, I'm talking about, do we want to end the nation state and have just one big globe? Cultural Marxists would say, yes, that's exactly what we want, and guess how we're going to run it? And you have a lot of different schools of thought around that. Like, has anybody here heard of anti-colonialism? Of course, colonialism is not a very good thing. Nobody wants to go back to the days of colonies. But at the same time, what anti-colonialism is they say that capitalism is nothing more than an economic form of colonialism. And that we use capitalism, free market dynamics, to suck resources out of poor countries to enrich rich countries, and we're essentially stealing from all the poor countries of the world, and we need to give the money back. Now, even Bono, the lead singer for U2, who also works for the United Nations as, I forget exactly what his role in the United Nations is, but he deals with poverty in third world countries. Even Bono says AIDS is a Band-Aid. Free markets are the cure. Even Bono says that. He said that. He said, I can't believe he's a rock star. I'm saying this. But he's been there, he's lived it, he's experienced it. He's been doing that with the United Nations now for 15 or 20 years. If you see it, and you see how countries emerge from the kind of horrendous poverty that socialists want to solve. We all want to solve poverty. Nobody's like, I want this guy to be poor. Nobody wants that. The question is, how do you do it? And when you look at the countries that have emerged as rich countries, I would defy anyone. You can find countries that became rich through free markets and then went socialist. I would defy anyone to find me a country that emerged as a wealthy nation through collectivism. I would defy anyone to name a single one. You won't do it. The closest you'll get is Israel, which was created by rich nations through United Nations Charter and given a lot of money from rich nations. They kind of started rich, and they kind of started socialist. And yeah, if you give a country enough money at the beginning, it's possible. But no country has ever emerged rich through a collectivist system. No country has ever welfared itself into prosperity. It's never happened. And I would defy anybody, anywhere, online or here, to name an example of one that did. So, if we believe the non-aggression principle is something that is a beautiful thing that has to be enforced, then we either want to have some kind of a federalist global structure that enforces it while still allowing individual countries, individual states, individual people to be free, or we need to have nation states. I don't know any other way around that. But those that want globalism, that want to eliminate boundaries, some of them are on the libertarian side of the spectrum. More of them are on the cultural Marxist side of the spectrum. have to talk a little bit about cultural Marxism and the alt-right, because I don't know if anybody has ever read something on like Salon or anything that talks about how libertarianism is the gateway drug to the alt-right. I see these articles all the time. I reviewed my blog all the time. That's not true. When you look at what the alt-right believes, if you truly believe that the world is that people identify as groups, whether by race, whether by sex, whether by sexual preference, whatever, that they go into identity groups, and that's what they identify as. And then you say, this group is oppressing everybody else. And what we're going to do is we're going to oppress them and elevate them and squeeze everybody together. Well, it's just natural. It's logical for some of the people who believe that, who happen to be on the group that is told is on the top. It's logical for some to say, you know what, I'd rather stay here. So when you look at the alt-right, you look at the things that they believe. Richard Spencer is a socialist. He doesn't believe in individual freedom. He believes in socialism. He believes in all of this. He has the exact same worldview that everybody else who believes in critical theory has, that everybody else who believes in identity politics has. The difference is when they tell him white people are on top, he says, okay, cool, let's stay there. And if you believe in that worldview, now you have two choices. You can either say, okay, cool, let's compress everybody together, or you can say, if that is the social structure, then it's good. That's all the alt-right is there people that look at the way the left looks at the world and says, I agree with you that that's what it looks like, but I don't want you to change it. As libertarians, of course we want change. We want everybody to be treated as an individual. We don't want identity structure to matter at all. We don't look at the world from a prism of identity groups. So, you know, that's the alt-right. And it's hard to believe in libertarian values and believe in identity politics at the same time. Those two concepts are at odds with one another. Either we are individuals, either we are free to live our lives as we see fit to achieve, or not. It's hard to take these two separate concepts. This is why I say it is an existential threat to libertarianism, because I can't imagine any way to take those two concepts, those two separate concepts. You know, cultural Marxism and postmodernism blended very nicely. One kind of created a cover for the other. But it's hard to take that and then blend it back with the Enlightenment. They're opposed. Now, once we understand it, yeah.
Just want to make sure we have time for questions. So.
Yeah, I'm almost finished. I've got a couple more slides. Once we understand that it's an ideological battle, that only one side or the other can win, or we can just slug it out forever, then the question comes, how do we win the ideological battle? And the obvious answer is with facts, reason, and logic. But what the left does very, very well, that the right doesn't always do, the conservatives don't always do, and that includes libertarians, we don't focus on emotion. We don't focus on right and wrong. We don't frame it in a way that it connects with people. Now we'll say, yeah, socialism would be great if it worked, but it doesn't work. No, socialism wouldn't be great if it worked. Socialism sucks. We have to frame it in the kind of emotional way that resonates with people, that sells with people. We're on the right side of history. There's no reason why we can't do that. We also have to make it cool. We have to make it appeal to youthful desires to rebel and to create a better world. We have to show kids, this is how you do it. You don't do it by going over there to the collectivists. You do it by working as an individualist. You do it through libertarian values. You do it through the Enlightenment. We also have to vote as a bloc. If we've got 70% of the vote, we should vote with 70% of the public, or 22%, whatever it is. The idea that we can take somebody who should be supported by 22% of the population and at least be supported by 3%, we've got to do better at voting as a bloc. We can't be just Republicans and Democrats and libertarians, but we're all libertarians. We have to vote as a bloc. I don't know how you do that other than teaching that there's an existential threat out there that, you know, if you don't vote as a group, we're in trouble. The other thing we have to do is we have to move the needle. We have to focus not only on, well, he's not libertarian enough for me, I'm not going to vote for him. We have to try to move the needle in the right direction, because that's what the left does. That is what cultural Marxism does. They're happy to take the long road, and we're not going to beat that overnight. You also notice I've got the exact same slide from a different source. Mine's small because it is not the source that has the high resolution. In conclusion, we talked about what libertarianism is and what percentage of the population libertarian values actually meet. We talked about postmodernism, critical theory, political correctness, and what those things are. We contrasted cultural Marxism with liberty. We discussed the ideological battle. Covered a lot in a relatively small amount of time. I know we want to have time for questions, so I'll go ahead and move on to that. Good.
I'm absolutely agreeing with you in regards to we need to be able to approach these arguments not only logically but emotionally as well. I've always found that touting emotionally the moralistic aspects tends to work well, well, better than simple logic more often than not. What are avenues you think are useful in regards to that emotional, I guess, more moralistic type arguments that we can use?
How many people did Stalin kill? How many people did Mao kill? If you're going to say that everybody has to follow the state, everybody has to follow the leader, what do you do with those that say no? If you're going to say that, you know, they start out with these nice things. They say, well, you know, if you want to paint, you should be able to paint. You shouldn't have to go work in a factory. You shouldn't have to go work on the farm. You should be able to do what you want to do. And that sounds nice. If you don't want to work at all, we'll give you a stipend. You know, that sounds nice. We're going to take care of everybody. Nobody has to do the back-breaking work of working in a factory. Well, great, but now who's going to make the clothes? Who's going to build the houses? Who's going to make the cars? Who's going to make the food? When you look at Venezuela, Venezuela didn't collapse because the capitalists were evil people who said we're not going to produce. No, what happened was it was not profitable to produce. Nobody did so. And after a while, you didn't have the food to feed the people. You didn't have the clothing to clothe the people. Now they're out eating dogs, and the Venezuelan government at one point said breed rabbits. They breed quickly, and they're good food. So, you know, that's how you approach it. You look at it, you say, not only doesn't it work, but look what it leads to. Do you want food to wait for you, or do you want to wait for food? And when you have to be logical, but you have to bring that logic with an emotional punch. It's not good enough to say it doesn't work. You have to also say, even if it did, it goes against every fiber of the human condition. Next question, was over here.
Yeah, I'm curious. You mentioned on the last slide about voting as a block, and I got the impression that what you were saying and kind of with your whole presentation is really just voting as a block against leftists rather than voting for liberty?
No. What I mean is, how many people in this room voted for Rand Paul in the Republican primary?
He dropped out.
Well, in fairness, he did. It was still on the ballot, but he dropped out of the election. That's true. But let's say that Rand Paul had been on the Republican primary. Now, you might not vote for Rand Paul in the general election, but what if he was the Republican nominee? Now you've got somebody who is a self-described libertarian, maybe not the perfect libertarian, but no, there is no perfect libertarian. It's a party of one. None of us will agree with everybody else on exactly what a libertarian is. And as a consequence, you've got a party that's probably 7 or 8% of the party. If you just do a poll and say, what party are you in? It's more than 3%. But a lot of people say, well, it's not McAfee, I'm not voting. Not McAfee, McCaffrey. No, so you had a lot of people who said, it's not my candidate that won the primary, so I'm not going to. You can't do that. We've got to be rational here. If it's either Trump, Hillary Clinton, or Gary Johnson, pick one of the three and let's vote for the guy. Now, which one is the most apt to forward libertarian values? Which one is the most apt to move the needle in the right direction? And if we keep moving the needle in the right direction, we never need a perfect candidate to get it there. We just need somebody better than the last guy who will continue to move the needle the right way. That's what cultural Marxists do. They've been moving it the wrong way for 100 years. We just start fighting back. Any other questions?
Yeah, you mentioned on the slide the alt-left, or the alt-right is kind of on the political left.
Well,
we could expand on
I don't think I could say that they're on the political left because they hate the left, and the left hates them. Antifa is the answer to the alt-right. What I'm saying is, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. With the alt-right, they're very, very much against what the left wants to do. But that doesn't mean they look at the world any differently than the left does. That just means that they look at the world the way the left does and says, I don't like your solution to this. And they're very, very opposed to the left's solution to it, so they're out looking for, how do we have political power? Richard Spencer coined the phrase alt-right. What does alt-right mean? Alternative to the right. You can oppose the left without being on the right. And if libertarians are the most conservative at all, you're over here instead of over here. You're not here, you're here. So, yeah, they call themselves right because they want to vote against the left. And in that, they do have some agreement, at least on who to vote for with us. But we don't share that ideology. We reject everything they believe in. We don't look at the world with the same prism. So, for somebody to say that being a libertarian makes you all bullshit. Yeah, I guess you could say we're an alternative to the Republican Party, but hell, we're more right than they are.
So we'll start calling them the alt-Ron.
That's not a bad idea. You certainly want to
When you put
disassociate from that.
Yeah, when you put the word right in there,
Well,
correctness.
who created the phrase right?
Right equals correct. No, but it doesn't.
Sure, it doesn't, but that was Richard Spencer who created that. What he's doing is he's saying, I want to be a big boy. I want to have a big voice. What can I call myself to get there? Who can I recruit from? Well, I'm not going to recruit very well from the left, but maybe I'll find people on the right, because of their hatred for the left, maybe they'll put up what was his name, Pepe the frog, whatever it is. Maybe I can start getting converts from over here because they also oppose the left. But we have to oppose them. We can't, you don't want to climb into bed with the devil. Other questions?